I'm Jason Aleksander. I'm a professor of philosophy at San Jose State University. And
I'm John Bugbee, visiting scholar at the University of Virginia.
And John and I are here today to talk about Paradiso 4, which I think I'll set up just very briefly and then ask John for some of his thoughts about it. So Paradiso 4 is in the sphere of the moon. It is initiated at the outset of the canto. We have the pilgrim trapped in a situation of doubt. He's paralyzed indeed by his doubts to such a degree that he doesn't even articulate them himself. Beatrice has to extract from his mind the doubts that are plaguing him. These doubts are occasioned by the conversation that he'd had in Paradiso 3 with Piccarda Donati and the Empress Costanza. Piccarda does all of the talking in that conversation in Paradiso 3. But we're probably going to focus more on one of the two doubts in our conversation today, given a number of interests that John and I share in the canto. So John, the second doubt in particular is the one that I think we might want to focus on the most. That's the doubt that Beatrice summarizes at line 64 through 69, where she intuits that the pilgrim is concerned that there's a kind of unjust justice in heaven, that the blessed are not equally blessed in their rewards. So I'd like you to speak to that doubt and your thoughts about Beatrice's response to that doubt. And you want to start with just in general what interests you about the canto and why that particular intervention on Beatrice's part is interesting to you.
Yeah, well, all about the will. I'm in the midst of a years-long project of writing about the will in the purgatory. And it comes in some very parallel ways, I think. So what's interesting and possibly troubling to me about what goes on in Purgatory 4 is really the way that Beatrice answers the doubt, solves Dante's problem, as it were, looks, at least at first glance, rather brutal. I like to remind people that in a medieval court of law, the description given for what happens to Piccarda and Costanza would have been rape. Raptus, the word was used to, as you'll know, is to cover both what we call rape and kidnapping, which is what happened to them. And in that context, that's just sort of to, foreground the seriousness of what we're dealing with. And when you bring that context to mind, the way Beatrice solves the problem starts to look a little bit like what in the modern context we would call blaming the victim. That is, she basically says, well, Dante, you're worried about injustice here. You're worried that these women may be punished for something that was violence, is her word, that was outside their control. But you shouldn't worry about that because actually, to some extent, it was in their control. That is, not that they could have avoided it in the first place, but they didn't resist as hard as they could have, right? That's her answer. At some point, they had to be sort of untied and let to go about their new life in this place they were kidnapped off to, places. And at that point, they could have run away and run back to the monastery, and for fear of presumably getting killed or something like that, they did not. So they didn't give their 110% resistance there. I suspect that most modern readers in coming across that will be inclined to say that's rather harsh standard of judgment. Of course they didn't, but it was because they're sort of choosing the lesser of two evils. They were afraid of what would happen to them if they did try to get away, and therefore we should cut them some slack. And it appears, at least at first, that Beatrice is not inclined to cut them any slack.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You and I are both interested in some of the things that might mitigate or soften that view or that apparent answer. But I mentioned to you that in the past I had a Sister of Mercy when I taught at St. Xavier University. I had a Sister of Mercy come and do guest lectures whenever I was teaching this canto and Canto 5, which concerns the question of dispensation of vows. And she came in and she would tell the students she just thought this was an unconscionable view. She just thought, when Beatrice says that Costanza and Piccarda should have been more like Mucius and St. Lawrence in their resoluteness my friend, the sister, would say that's just crazy. That's not recognizing what human beings actually are. That's not recognizing the things that are actually within our power and within our control. So, yeah, I think there's a troubling view that's articulated in Beatrice's response to this second doubt, this doubt about the status of Picarda and Costanza in the sphere of the moon. But as I said, there are some other mitigating points of view too. So I don't know if you want to address some of those.
Yeah, well, the one that I'd like to throw out, it involves some parallels with other parts of the Commedia, really. There are a couple. I mean, one to throw out and leave alone is that I think what goes on here is very parallel with the overarching question across the whole Commedia about the righteous pagans. But that would take 20 minutes to talk about in itself, so I'll leave it out. But sort of more modestly, there's a strong parallel with what happens in the center of the Commedia, with these philosophical speeches that Virgil gives to Dante in Cantos 17 and 18 of the Purgatorio. Because I think basically the last of those speeches is prompted by a complaint from Dante. And I think if you look at it abstractly, the complaint is the same complaint. Basically, this is the speech about love, and Dante says to Virgil, Virgil, you've just told me that love is the basis of everything we do, but I asked you to explain what love was, and what you said was, well, you gave this account of love that makes it sound pretty much mechanical, almost automatic. It's just something that happens. It happens inside you, but it nonetheless happens without your volition. It's just what humans do, right? Presto ad amore, we're created quick to love. Yeah. So Dante reasonably draws the disturbing conclusion that in that case, everything we do is sort of automatic in this way. How can there be praise and blame? If you think about it, that's very similar to the protest that's coming up in Dante's mind here, because he's sort of starting from the same major premise, which is that humans should not be punished, or should, in this case, in paradise, should not have their merit diminished, their reward diminished, by things that were not under their control, right? What's really interesting to me is that if you look at these two passages in parallel, it appears that Virgil in 18 of Purgatory and Beatrice here answer the question in the same way. They both say to Dante, that unspoken major premise that you have in the back of your mind, it's correct. God, is not actually going to punish people for what was not under their control. In each case, they say there's a minor premise here that needs adjustment. So Virgil says, you're thinking about love as the basis of everything, but it's not just love, it's actually love plus free choice, libero arbitrio, yeah? And if you factor that in, you see that we do have some control over our actions, and so morality makes sense. And
Yeah.
same thing here. Beatrice says, the major premise is correct. What's not correct is that you're thinking that Costanza and Picarda had absolutely no control over what happened to them. In fact, they had at least a little control. There we're back to the trouble. They could have resisted more than they did. And the reason that's a mitigation is, if you bring all that together, it helps you think, oh, well, Dante is saying this. Dante is having Beatrice say this, this apparently brutal logic, not merely because he's a jerk or a medieval bastard, right? But also because he's just so concerned to preserve that major premise. He wants the world to function in a just way. He wants people not to be punished for things beyond their control. So he attacks the minor premise instead and says, yeah, look carefully, and there was at least a little bit they could have done.
Yeah. So there are two things that I want to kind of come back to in what you've just said. And so let's put a pin in one and make sure to come back to it in a moment. And that is this notion of absolute versus conditional will, right? So we have Picarda talking about the notion that the veil remained part of her absolute will. So we can come back to that. I know that's in the interest of both of us, but you said a number of other things that relate to some of my long-standing interests in the topic of free will. and the notion of free choice in the Divine Comedy, and why I'm interested in it. And there's two basic things here. I mean, the first is this notion that moral responsibility, that praise and blame are hinged on agency and on on the extent to which we're in control of our own actions. So if we're not in control of our own actions, they're neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy. They can only be praised or blamed legitimately to the extent that we are in control of them. But the question of what actually constitutes libero arbitrium, or free choice, for Dante, I think is a very complicated question. And I don't think it's as easy as it appears. So you have the line in Paradiso 5, for instance, that emphasizes that free will, whatever it is the greatest gift ever given to human beings. But when you look at what's going on in the central cantos of Purgatorio and at the outset of Paradiso 4, the notion of what a free choice might mean, I think, comes under a certain kind of it's ambiguous, and there's an interesting scrutiny that I think is being offered on the nature of free choice. So the very paralysis that starts the canto gives us some interesting hints, at least in terms of the history of the development of the thinking about the relationship between free will and intellect, for instance. We don't have, in the case of the pilgrim, a lack of desire or a lack of motivation. There's not a lack of affect. He's got the affect, he's got the desire, right? And so desire can determine our actions, it can motivate us. If we give in to desire without reflection, then we're being compelled by desire rather than exercising free choice. So the question of what free will might mean in relationship to desire is an interesting one, but the answer that seems to be in play for Dante, because of the way the canto opens, is that intellect is crucial for there being an actual free choice. The paralysis of the pilgrim is occasioned by a lack of intellectual determination. He has two doubts that weigh equally on his mind. And because they weigh equally on his mind, on his intellect, he's not able to move. And Beatrice literally has to intervene and resolve that doubt for him, right? So the paralysis is a result of some kind of intellectual deficiency, rather than some kind of deficiency in the affective part of the soul or in the will itself. It resides in the intellect. So intellect in some way has to be figured into the account of what it means to have free will to begin with. Now, how that might connect with Piccardo and Costanza, I think, is a little bit more difficult to suss out, but I think that's one mitigating factor, right? If we want to say that our responsibility is hinged on, to a certain degree, our intellectual awareness, then free will becomes, to a certain degree, parallel to judgment, right? Our free will is improved to the extent that our critical capacities and our capacity for judgment is improved. And I think you can find other kinds of hints in the Divine Comedy that suggest that this is a view that's being defended. And I think that's true in the central cantos in Purgatorio. But I don't think that's the be-all, end-all either, right? I do think that there are other theological elements in play. So do you want to come back to the Piccardo and Costanza bit and the distinction between absolute and conditional will, or do you want to bring in any of the other kinds of theological considerations that you and I have discussed for years now? Or where should we go from here?
Yeah. Well, one thing I was thinking, just in your describing the Buridan's ass, anachronistically so-called, episode at the beginning of Canto 4, it's striking to me that the way Beatrice resolves it, right? She's the one who chooses which desire to go for first, which doubt to resolve first. And the way she does it actually is... it's debatable whether it's by having a superior intellect per se. I would say she has more information than Dante. I mean, she makes the choice in virtue of a rule of sorts, a reason, and her reason is one of them has more poison than the other, right? So I don't know, for you, you're probably considering that as part of intellect. Certainly it's under that part of the soul, but it's not. I just wanted to point out that it's not a matter of having more cognitive power exactly. It's
No. I mean, I think you're right. She's got more information. Right. I think her judgment is her capacity for judgment is in that sense superior to the pilgrims. And yes, she identifies that one doubt has more venom. And so she says, I'm going to start with the one that has more venom. He's clearly not aware of that. Otherwise, he may not have been, in a state of equilibrium between the two doubts. There's one other thing, and then I'll turn it back over to you. I mean, the literal language of doubling and of doubting in this canto seem to me to go hand in hand, right? So you have the doubts that the pilgrim is paralyzed by. You have Beatrice referring to those doubts, but then she also doubles the doubts. Like, so she'll say, well, there were two distinct possibilities here. Let me treat the first one first, then the second one second. And then later on in the canto, there's even an explicit but a very ambiguous and difficult passage having to do with doubt itself being responsible for, spurring us toward the truth, like pulling our intellect is how I kind of think of it, pulling our intellect towards some kind of goal. So doubting itself has some kind of doubting and doubling both have some kind of interesting role to play in whatever's going on in this canto. But why don't we come back to at least what seems to mitigate, the other thing that seems to mitigate what seems like a harsh logic about Picardo and Costanza. In Canto 5, we discovered that it wouldn't have been legitimate for them to seek dispensation of their vows. And so that also is a kind of hard economic logic. But in this canto, it's about whether they really are less deserving as a consequence of that conditional will. Can you take us through that? In
a perfect world, yeah. I mean, of course, the basic idea is that Dante, as so often happens in the structure of the Paradiso in particular, right, one solution raises a doubt in his mind, and Beatrice, again, pulls that doubt out of his mind and says, I see you are having another doubt, so let's explore that one. And in this case, the solution that Beatrice has given seems to conflict with what he's heard from Picardo in the previous canto, right? Picardo said this thing about Costanza's affection for the veil never left her heart, phrases, something like that. Whereas, Beatrice has said, well, it wasn't prosecuted to the full extent of possibility, right? And those seem to conflict. And Beatrice's solution to this one is, well, we need a distinction between absolute will and another kind of will, which she doesn't actually name, but we might call conditional will. And she says, what I say and what Picardo say can both be true, because if Picardo says the will never left Costanza's heart, she's referring to the absolute will, like abstracted from the circumstances. Costanza still wanted to be a nun, right? But if we can bring in all the relevant surrounding factors, then she didn't want to be a nun enough to make her risk getting shot in the back by a crossbow or whatever, to run away and try to go back. So at that point, he is starting to sound, Dante, the poet, is starting to sound a little bit more like his Aristotelian source. We haven't really talked about much, but he's very clearly, he's directly quoting here in a few places from the third book of the Nicomachean Ethics, this consideration of force and the will and what's voluntary and what's involuntary. And at first, it looks like he's being much more hardline than Aristotle and simply saying, no, you absolutely have to do what's right no matter what the surrounding circumstances are. But then that raises the second protest in Dante's mind, the second doubt. And when Beatrice resolves that, it begins to look like there's at least a little space in his thinking, in Dante's poet's thinking, for what Aristotle does, for saying, well, there are cases in which you consider the attendant circumstances and you're not going to evaluate the person at the center of this mess the same way you would if the circumstances weren't there. Does that do the job? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're kind of running low on time here, but there is maybe one other mitigating factor that we could also bring into play and both say something about, and that is we've emphasized this Aristotelian element, we've emphasized some of these difficult conversations around the relation of intellect and will, but what we haven't talked about is one other possible tie-in with the rest of the commedia, which is Beatrice does this intervention, and in part that's because her intellect is, I think, better prepared than the pilgrims to be able to handle the doubts. But on the other hand, it might also signal the operation of divine grace. And so there may be hints that there's more to the story here than just the question of divine justice, right? That if we look only at the question of justice, then yeah, there do seem to be some kind of competing claims on whether Picardo or Costanza should have done something different, right? Had they the power to do that, or whether it was within their power to do that or not. But the fact that the answer is given by Beatrice may also emphasize not only that her intellect is better prepared than the pilgrims, but it might also indicate that we have this view that the human situation, the temporal condition for human beings, is one in which our capacity for free will is severely diminished by our intellectual limitations or by other limitations, right? In other words, the role of divine grace and the in terms of attunement or atonement, attunement to God might also be emphasized here, right? The pilgrim can't get himself out of this situation. It's not through any fault of his own that he's in this state of paralysis. Although he's also in a state where he's prepared to be instructed, right? But he can't get himself out of it. There is a necessity for some kind of intervention. So I wanted to know if you had any last thoughts about that, about the kind of any theological project that might be associated with this view, at least in your eyes.
Yeah. Well, it opens the possibility of a much more positive spin on the particular line that Beatrice gives to Dante. Che la forza al voler si miscia. At line, that's 107. I want you to understand that force mixes itself with the will. And at first that sounds grim, but it's a very hopeful thing. And I think it's a very strong theme of the whole commedia, really, certainly starting with the Purgatory, that we humans are not completely in control of ourselves. Our will is not our own all the way down. And in fact, saying that Dante is prepared to listen is a big part of that. You see that in the invocation of the Muse at the beginning of each cantica, how it changes each time. I mean, the third one is open me up and blow me away, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's very, very in tune with what I believe Dante conceived to be a Christian, as specifically opposed to a Stoic understanding of what the will is. That it's not our own, that it at its core depends on an external force, namely God. And I think, yeah, it's very in tune with things that were going on theologically in Dante's time. I mean, maybe most obviously resonant to my ears with some things you find in the Franciscans, in Bonaventure, in particular, the book, the Mind's Journey into God, and similar meditations, really. Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's more to be said about all of this. We haven't really reached any particular resolution on this in our conversation about these various themes, but I hope that gives anyone who's watching this a kind of sense of some possibilities that may be worth exploring. As always, it's just a real pleasure to me to be able to talk to you about these, John.
Thanks. Yeah, likewise.